afternoon, everyone. Welcome to All About ESEA, an in-depth look at homeless children and youth in ESEA reauthorization. My name is Barbara Duffield. I'm the Director of Policy and Programs at NAEHCY, and I am joined today by a very special guest, Philip Lovell, the Vice President of Policy and Programs at the Alliance for Excellent Education, and by our Director of State Project and Legal Affairs, Patricia Julianell. For those of you who are not familiar with NAEHCY, NAEHCY is a national membership association dedicated to educational excellence for children and youth experiencing homelessness from early care through higher education. Through state and federal policy and technical assistance, we work on systems change so all children and youth can learn, succeed, and achieve their dreams. Philip, why don't you tell us about the Alliance?
Hi, everybody. Thanks very much for having me. The Alliance for Excellent Education is a national policy and advocacy organization. Our mission is for all kids to graduate from high school, college, and career ready. And a lot of our work resides in the federal level, where we try to influence federal education policy primarily at the high school level in order to increase student achievement and student attainment.
Just a little bit of housekeeping note for those of you joining us. We have everyone muted except the presenters to keep noise at a minimum. And how we will be doing questions is we'll be taking written questions in the chat box. So anytime during the presentation, if you have a question, go ahead and type it into the chat box and make sure to send your question to the public, so that we will be able to see it. And either Patricia will respond directly to your question when you ask it in the chat box, or she'll save it and we'll answer your question over the phone when we break for questions towards the end. So without further ado, we will get going. Our topic today, Elementary and Secondary Education Act reauthorization. Just to let you know where things are, sort of the current status, we have two bills that have each passed their respective chambers. The Every Child Achieves Act of 2015 is the Senate bill. It passed in July 16th by a wide margin, by 81 to 17. It was a bipartisan bill, and the process was a bipartisan process in getting it through the committee. There were several days of debate, many amendments that were offered, and many adopted. On the House side, we have H.R. 5, which also passed in July, but by a much slimmer margin, by 2018 to 213. This was a partisan bill and a process that was a partisan process, meaning that it represents the Republican vision for ESEA reauthorization. So where we are at now, what needs to happen next is a House-Senate Conference Committee must meet, and their job is to work out the differences between the two different bills. They have to come up with a bill that reconciles the differences, and then each chamber has to pass the reconciled bill before it would even move on to the president's desk for him to consider signing it. So that sort of procedurally is where we are at. And what we wanted to do with this webinar is to sort of let you know where the bills have commonalities, what's similar between them, and then where the differences are, because in the differences is where we will see either one vision or the other vision, or a mixed version in the final product. So I'm going to turn it over to Philip to talk about the big picture in ESEA.
All right. So thanks again for having me. I have had the pleasure of working with Barbara and Patricia over the years, and I just think that the work that you guys do is amazing and awesome and incredibly important for the population of homeless students. And just for everyone on the phone, just know that particularly for the members of NAEHCY, just want you to know that, at least from my perspective, your organization is extremely well represented, and no one knows this stuff like Barbara Duffield. So I'm happy to provide the overview of some of the sort of traditional education issues, but certainly when it comes to the homeless stuff, I need that update as well. So let's see. So like Barbara had said, H.R. 5 and the Senate bill S 1177 were both passed, and the bills they're different, but they do have some similarities. So among the similarities is that the accountability system within the No Child Left Behind Act. So the system of sanctions that schools had to go through if they did not make adequate yearly progress. That is all eliminated in both the House bill and the Senate bill. There is no more adequate yearly progress. There's no more corrective action. There's no more restructuring. All of that is gone, and the accountability systems are largely left up to the states. Another commonality between the two bills. Some may be familiar with the School Improvement Grant Program. This is the program that got a lot of attention because districts that take these funds and that use them in schools have to use the funding in order to make drastic changes in schools, including firing half the teachers and the principal, and you can use the funding in order to close schools. This program has been changed substantially, and neither bill retain these provisions. In fact, in the House bill, the program is eliminated entirely. The Senate bill provides funding for low-performing schools, but it does not require those types of activities to be implemented with the funds. A third big similarity between the two bills is that they both limit the ability of the Department of Education to issue regulations, and they really limit the ability of the federal government to intervene in state decisions around accountability systems, sort of the whole goals and targets. The bill definitely, if NCL, some would say the NCLB swung the pendulum too far in the direction of federal control. Certainly, both of these bills swing the pendulum way into the other direction of state control. And we can go to the next slide. While there are some similarities, and I think the biggest similarity is the philosophical similarity that we're just describing around the need for the feds to take a step back. There are some differences. For example, in the House bill, a provision that's referred to as Title I portability is included. And what this means is that if a student is attending a Title I school and then goes to a school that has a lower poverty level that may not be a Title I receiving school, the funds for that student will go to the school that has, it'll go to the new school that has the lower poverty level. House Democrats see this as a major problem because they do not want Title I funding going to schools that lack high concentrations of poor kids. The House bill also eliminates many more programs than the Senate bill, and the House bill also lets kids opt out of assessments that are required under both bills. The Senate, and when the bill was on the Senate floor, there was an attempt to add this opt-out provision. There was also an attempt to add Title I portability. Those attempts failed in the Senate, but the opt-out provision is included in the House bill. So both bills, they include the requirement for state assessments. A number of folks are concerned that with the House's opt-out provision, what that means is that low-performing students might suddenly be encouraged to not attend school on the days of the tests in order to artificially increase the test scores for a school. So we can go to the next slide here, and this is just an overview of some of the major policies included within the legislation. Common Core state standards, under current law and current policy, although this gets, I think, miscommunicated frequently, there's no federal requirement for Common Core. What the House and the Senate bills do, they both require standards. The House bill does not include language that requires those standards to be of any certain caliber or quality. The Senate's bill requires that the standards be aligned with entrance requirements for the state system of public higher education. The intention there is to ensure that when kids graduate from high school, that they're actually ready for post-secondary education. The House bill does not include such a requirement. On testing, both bills require annual assessments. However, the Senate bill authorizes funding to support those assessments. Currently, $400 million is allocated annually by the federal government to support state assessments. The Senate maintains that funding. The House would eliminate that funding. What the House does is put those dollars into a block grant and then allows a portion of those funds from the block grant to be used to support the assessments. We see that as slightly problematic because under NCLB, states are using fairly low quality tests, largely because tests cost a lot. And if states don't have the money to pay for high quality tests, then kids will continue to be in a drill and kill environment. And if the funds are part of some big block grant and states have to make the political decision as to spend more money on, say, teacher salaries or spend money on testing, we know it's going to win. And we don't want to see the quality of state tests continue to go down. Both the House and Senate bill include support for assessment audits. The intention here is to make sure that we're not over-testing kids, and the Senate took that idea of not having too much testing a step further and actually requires states to set a limit on the time spent on assessments, both those required at the state level as well as those required at the local level. We can go to the next slide. The accountability provisions within the two bills have both important similarities and important differences. So the Senate bill removes the accountability requirements for low-performing schools and for student subgroups, similar to the House. So when I was saying earlier, there's no more AYP. There's no more federal requirements for what happens when students demonstrate low performance. That's consistent in the House and the Senate bill. The Senate bill does require goals to be set. It also requires the use of a multiple measure accountability system. It just doesn't require the schools, states to explicitly say you have to identify either a certain number of low performing schools, or you have to identify schools if they miss a certain threshold of performance. And both bills limit the ability to actually prohibit the federal government from meddling in state accountability policy. Like we said earlier, the Title I portability provision and the opt-out provision in the Senate bill, neither of those are permitted, or neither of those are included in the House. Title I portability is included. Opt-out is included. On effective teaching and professional development, a substantial change in policy here. Under ESEA waivers from the new policy that most states are implementing from the Department of Education, there's a requirement for teacher evaluation. And with ESEA, neither the Senate nor the House bill includes a requirement for teacher evaluation. Both bills provide pretty flexible funding for professional development, but they do not require states to implement a teacher evaluation system. So for a deeper dive on accountability, and we provide this deep dive because this is the big enchilada that the House and the Senate is really wrestling with. The White House and congressional Democrats, both in the House and in the Senate, have been pushing for a far stronger federal role in accountability than is present within the House and the Senate bill. There's a recognition that NCLB went too far, but there's a concern that neither the House nor the Senate bill includes the types of safeguards that should be present within federal education policy. In fact, just yesterday, there was an event on Capitol Hill. The three Democrats who voted against the Senate bill, Senator Cory Booker, Senator Elizabeth Warren, and Senator Chris Murphy, they held an event with Arne Duncan and the incoming acting secretary, John King, specifically focused on accountability and calling for stronger accountability within ESEA. The accountability provisions that they're looking for, there are three of them. They want to focus, ensure that NCLB, the new NCLB, the new ESEA, provides support to the lowest performing 5% of schools, and that's a provision that's currently within the waiver policy. They want to ensure that schools that have large achievement gaps receive support, and they want to make sure that if high schools where 1/3 or more students don't graduate, that those schools are included in the state accountability systems and that they are eligible for school improvement funding.
Thank you, Philip. So that let me just go back for half a second there. So we really are grateful for Philip and the Alliance for providing this overview of the big picture, because although NAEHCY, although we zero in on McKinney-Vento and the issues in Title I that are specific to children and youth who are homeless, homeless children and youth are part of the all. They are part of the every, and every child achieves, and they will be affected by policies that affect all low-income students. So it's really important to understand those big picture issues in the context in which all of education reform is happening, and also too to understand that McKinney-Vento is the caboose on the train of ESEA, and so some of these issues that may get in the way or that need to be reconciled, that'll affect all of the work that we do too in terms of the timing. But I do want to switch now to specifically the McKinney-Vento provisions within ESEA, starting with the amendments that are either exactly the same or very, very similar in both of the bills. And typically when you have something that's exactly the same, there's nothing to conference because it's the same, and so that goes into the final bill. So for the most part, this is what we could look if there were a conference that if it were done tomorrow, because these provisions are the same. This is what we would see for these next few slides. So some of the pieces that are the same: the requirement for state coordinators to be able to sufficiently carry out their duties, and also for state coordinators, state McKinney-Vento coordinators, to annually publish an updated list of liaisons on the state education agency website. This is something that many states already do, and it's obviously very important if you're trying to help your child or your unaccompanied youth or your service provider, and you want to know who the liaison is, but this would be then a requirement for all states. The next bullet here looks at the immediate enrollment provisions in McKinney-Vento, and really this is a clarification. Current law requires homeless children and youth to be enrolled in school immediately, but what both bills do is they add to say even if the student has missed application or enrollment deadlines during any period of homelessness. So fleshing out immediate enrollment in both bills. Also, the school stability provisions, which are in many ways the centerpiece of McKinney-Vento, those are almost exactly the same in both bills. And what they basically do is take what is best practice and what is federal guidance, and they codify it. They put it into the law. So they enhance school stability by requiring schools to presume that staying in the school of origin is in a child's best interest unless individual best interest factors, unless there's been a determination of individual best interest factors that show otherwise, that show that a change of schools is necessary. So as you know, under current law, school districts are required to keep a child in the school of origin if it's feasible, if it's what their parents or guardians wish, and then the Department of Ed has guidance that lists what are those things that should be considered as part of best interest or feasibility. Things like safety of the student, the time of how the commute would affect the child's education, the time left in the school year, a range of those factors. And what the legislation does here is essentially put that into the law. It doesn't list every single factor the way that the guidance does, but basically says that you have to just assume that you're going to keep the child in the same school unless there's been this determination that shows that a school change is in the best interest of the child. Also related to school stability, both bills amend the definition of school of origin. Under current law, school of origin is the school that the child or youth attended when they were permanently housed or the school in which they were last enrolled, and that's posed problems for kids who are moving between elementary and middle or between middle and high school because school of origin is the school of origin. So if they're in a feeder school system pattern, then they essentially lose their school of origin. This would amend this to include feeder schools so that if it was in a child's best interest to stay in that feeder school pattern, they would be able to do so. Another similarity in both bills is a stronger emphasis on the needs of youth who are homeless and on their own or unaccompanied homeless youth. So there's a new local liaison requirement to ensure that unaccompanied homeless youth are enrolled in school, that they have opportunities to meet state academic standards, and that they're informed of their status as independent students for financial aid and may obtain assistance to receive the verification for their FAFSA. So all of these we know are very important to make sure that students know that they can go into college, that they have the help they need to do that. Obviously, it's a motivator just to stay through high school if you know that you will be able to go on to college and get financial aid. Some other similarities are identical provisions in both of the bills. Both of the bills have a very strong emphasis on improving the identification of homeless students. There was a Government Accountability Office study July 2014 that found that school districts continue to struggle to identify students who are homeless, and both congressional committees, both chambers heard this. And so you'll see everything from the purpose of the state grant to the kinds of barriers that need to be removed, a much greater emphasis on improving identification of homeless students. Both bills also contain a provision around privacy, requiring schools to treat information about a homeless child or youth's living situation as part of their education record and not release this information to people who are not authorized under FERPA. And this too looks at stabilizing the education of homeless students so that we don't have overly aggressive efforts to, for example, confirm residency that end up having information shared about a student's homeless status and end up actually jeopardizing the student's housing and their safety. So both bills contain that provision. Now we're going to switch gears and talk just about the McKinney-Vento amendments that are only in the Senate bill. And in my experience, and Philip, maybe yours too, you know, when you have something where there's one bill says nothing and one bill says something, sometimes it's a straight up or down. It will either, the conference committee will either reject it or they'll accept it. But more often, what tends to happen is you see something in the middle. So you see the conference committee work to maybe not do exactly what the one bill did, but something along those lines. Or they could drop it entirely, or they could accept it. But I think in most cases, we tend to see something where there's something, in even just, if not exactly the same language, something along these lines. So the next few slides are really telling you kind of what's hanging in the balance for this conference committee to iron out. The Senate bill requires that state coordinators monitor school districts. Again, this is an expectation from the Department of Education, but now it would be an actual statutory requirement. The Senate bill also requires that local liaisons have sufficient time and training to carry out their duties. This too was one of the findings of the GAO report, that liaisons don't have the capacity to really carry out the duties that are in the law. And also that local liaisons participate in professional development and technical assistance that's offered by the state as the state deems that appropriate. So those are Senate-only provisions. The next slide here, the words that are underlined are the words that are new, that are added by the Senate bill. The rest of this on the slide, if it's not underlined, is current law. So this is the global mandate within McKinney-Vento for state education agencies and local education agencies to develop, review, and revise policies to remove barriers. Current law says to enrollment and retention. The Senate bill adds to identification and also adds as barriers to be addressed, barriers related to fees, fines, absences, and credit accrual policies. So looking towards these additional barriers that have been very frequently documented over the past 10 years that we know need to be addressed. Additional Senate provisions for McKinney-Vento, requirements for states to have procedures to ensure that homeless children and youth are able to receive appropriate credit for full or partial coursework that they completed satisfactorily at a prior school. This provision intended to make sure that students don't fall further behind due to their mobility and end up in a situation where they're not getting credit for work that they did, and it's a very strong disincentive to staying in school and graduating. So similar to some state legislation that's already in place in California and other places, this would require that they receive appropriate credit for full or partial coursework that they completed. Also, that they have access to a full range of academic programs. These programs are listed here. I won't go over all of them. You can read them on the slide, sort of fleshing out the kinds of programs that homeless students should have access to if they are eligible for them and if those programs are available. The Senate also looks at school success. You know, McKinney-Vento's history has really been as a door opener, identifying students, make sure they're enrolled, attending, and this looks forward to also school success. And so having policies at the state and local level to promote school success, including full participation in academic, but also in those extracurricular activities that are made available to non-homeless students. Now we're going to switch gears just a little bit and focus on the homelessness and foster care provisions within Title I. You'll notice that this says Senate bill only. That is because the House bill does not make any changes to homeless provisions within Title I. The House bill maintained current law. And the Senate bill, though, does contain some new language around homeless students and students in foster care. First of all, it requires that the state Title I plan describe how the state education agency will comply with the McKinney-Vento Act. And it also makes some changes to the Title I set-aside for homeless students. It authorizes the set-aside to be based on a needs assessment and to be used for services that aren't ordinarily provided, including for local liaisons and transportation to the school of origin. Now, for those of you who are saying, well, that's what we're already doing, that's good, because the last two budget bills, the last two appropriations bills, did explicitly make the funding of local liaisons and make transportation to the school of origin an allowable use of Title I funds, including the set-aside funds. What this change does is put it into the Title I statute, so it will no longer be part of the annual appropriations. It'll be part of the Title I law. Similarly, with the set-aside needs assessment, current federal guidance says that set-asides may be based on a needs assessment. This puts that into the statute as well. The Senate bill also clarifies that Title I set-aside is for all schools in a school district, not just for non-participating schools. Again, this is consistent with federal guidance that says that the Title I set-aside funds can be used to help a homeless child or youth in any school in the school district, whether it's school-wide, targeted, or non-participating. There's some additional pieces in the Senate bill with respect to state report cards. Current law does require states to put out annual state report cards on achievement and to include within that achievement disaggregation for very specific subgroups. The Senate bill maintains that, but it also adds homeless children and children and youth in foster care to state assessment disaggregation and graduation rate disaggregation for reporting purposes. So what this would do is mean that the annual state report card would have to break out achievement data and graduation rate data for homeless students, and then separately also for foster children and youth. And what this does is really help shine a light on the gaps that both groups of students face and set a marker for where they are compared to other groups. This is something that, 7 or 8 states are already doing this and reporting it, and NAEHCY polled state coordinators to ask whether they had the ability to do it, and over 40 states said yes, we could. We actually have this ability right now. So this was something that should not be a tremendously difficult task to accomplish, but would be helpful, particularly in showing the difference between students who are homeless and students who are disadvantaged. So we can see in every state that already does this that homelessness puts a child at risk of educational challenges above and beyond simply being poor. So we know we need to do more in terms of eliminating barriers and providing supports. Turning now to provisions around foster care, and again, this was within Title I. There is a requirement, let me back up for a second and just say that going into this reauthorization and the past few reauthorizations, our organization as well as child welfare organizations have been working through a list of issues that have come up in the implementation of McKinney-Vento and also in the wake of Fostering Connections, which is the child welfare law that has provisions around educational stability. And there's a recognition, certainly on the NAEHCY side, on the homeless side, that while there are many, many similarities between children and youth who are homeless and those who are in foster care in terms of mobility and barriers to access and trauma, one very significant difference between the two populations is the presence of child welfare agencies that are funded and legally charged for the well-being, including the educational stability of those children, whereas for children and youth who are homeless, there really isn't any equivalent of a child welfare agency, no one with legal responsibility, and oftentimes it really is just the school district that's providing services, and the liaison may be the only advocate in that child's life. So recognition both of similarities and similar barriers, but also of some key distinctions. So with that little bit of context now, to talk about the state Title I plans, in the Senate bill, there's a requirement that the state education agency describe the steps it will take to collaborate with the state child welfare agency around the education of children and youth in foster care, including several assurances. First, that foster youth are enrolled or remain in their school of origin unless a determination is made that it's not in their best interest. Second, that determination must be based on best interest factors, including consideration of the appropriateness of the current educational setting and the proximity to school in which the child is enrolled at the time of placement. That language there around best interest factors, appropriateness, and proximity mirrors almost verbatim the language in the child welfare legislation around educational stability for children, youth, and foster care in terms of the responsibilities of child welfare agencies. So there would be reciprocity and matching language in federal education and federal child welfare law. Third assurance, when a determination is made that it's not in the best interest to remain in the school of origin, that the child be immediately enrolled in a new school. So altogether, very McKinney-Vento-esque provisions around school stability and enrollment within Title I for all children and youth in foster care. Also a requirement that the state education agency designate a point of contact for the state child welfare agency. That point of contact would oversee the implementation of the state education agency responsibilities. And also that state education agency point of contact can't be the same person as the McKinney-Vento state coordinator. The recognition here that it's a big job to be the McKinney-Vento state coordinator, a lot of coordination between many, many different kinds of state and local agencies, and also that the foster care point of contact will have a big job on their hands just coordinating with all the relevant child welfare agency groups. So a complete separation of roles at the state level. In terms of foster care in the local Title I plans, the Senate bill requires that within 1 year of enactment, school districts develop and implement plans for the transportation of foster youth to their school of origin when it's necessary, when it's in their best interest. I think the language of the law actually says develop and implement plans for how transportation will be provided, arranged, and funded. These would be local plans developed in collaboration with the local child welfare agency. And then there's some specificity about payment. School districts would be required to provide transportation to the school of origin only if they are reimbursed by the child welfare agency, or if they agree to provide it, or if they agree to split the costs. So a local plan there, but some limitations on when child welfare agencies are actually required to provide it, if they're reimbursed, if they agree to provide it or to split it. And lastly, within the local Title I plans, school districts are required to designate a point of contact if the corresponding child welfare agency notifies the school district in writing that it has designated a point of contact for the school district. Again, here too, looking for reciprocity. If the child welfare agency has an education point of contact, then the school district would have a point of contact for foster youth. So to have two systems talking to each other again, and this would kick into place once the child welfare agency notifies the school district in writing of its point of contact for education. And with that, as you can see, very McKinney-Vento-esque provisions within Title I, but that acknowledge the role of the child welfare agency with 1 year of enactment. Then within 1 year of enactment, awaiting foster care placement is deleted from McKinney-Vento Act. I think it actually, the law may actually say after 1 year, but basically 1 year after the law is signed, awaiting foster care placement is deleted from McKinney-Vento. So we would have two separate programs and efforts that are coordinating with each other, but McKinney-Vento will be focusing on the needs of children and youth who are homeless, and the Title I provisions focusing on the needs of children and youth who are in foster care. And lastly, now to look at the funding levels, obviously a very challenging issue. And while we're looking here at McKinney-Vento, this is a challenge that exists across programs, education programs in both bills, where the Senate bill authorizes such sums as may be necessary for the fiscal years, whereas the House bill actually freezes federal funding for education programs at the level that they were last appropriated at. So in other words, at their current funding level. For McKinney-Vento, this amounts to a cut of a reduction in the authorized funding level. Currently, McKinney-Vento is authorized at sort of like what Congress envisioned was the right size for the program back in 2001 at $70 million. We've never reached $70 million. We're at $65 million, and the House bill would sort of say that's as big as this program really should be. So again, those differences in funding authorizations reflecting just a larger difference philosophically between the two bills. So with that, here is the $10 bazillion million question, which is what happens next? And Philip, I am going to turn it over to you and have you talk a little bit about this, and then I'll throw in my 2 cents as well.
Great, thanks, Barbara. So what happens next? An excellent, excellent question. So first, they have to get through the policy issues. They have to be able to produce a bill that can actually pass both the House and the Senate. Now, interestingly, when the House, like Barbara mentioned this earlier, when the House passed their ESEA bill, they did so with 218 votes, and 218 votes is the bare minimum that they can have in order to pass a piece of legislation. They actually lost quite a few Republican votes, and so it looks like they will need to rely on Democratic votes in order to get the bill passed, which means that the bill is going to have to be less conservative than the bill that passed the House, which proposes a challenge because here on the second bullet point, there will be a new Speaker of the House, and the internal dynamics of the House mean that that new Speaker is going to need to flex some conservative muscles there, and so their willingness, their interest in producing a bill that is less conservative than the current House bill is going to be an issue. That said, there are folks working behind the scenes, really around the clock to come up with a compromise. Hopefully, both sides will see that there's a political gain to actually demonstrate that they can govern, and the staff and the key members are working to have this to get this deal done, so that if they can convince leadership to bring it to the floor for a final vote, um, they'll be well positioned to do so. In other words, they don't want the reason for this thing to not happen to be because of the policy. They want to get the policy done, and then if they can make the politics works, then this thing will be ready to go. For the next several months, there's certainly the issue of the congressional calendar that's getting in the way. There are a lot of issues that need to be dealt with by the end of the year. There's the annual budget, there's the debt ceiling, and there are some other big issues. There's the transportation bill, there's extenders, there's the Import-Export Bank. So there are some other pretty big issues that need to be dealt with, and all of this needs to happen while the House is figuring out who's going to be the next speaker. So so getting this done over the next, before the end of the calendar year, which was originally really a goal, is going to be hard. Could it happen early next year? We certainly hope so. Deeper into the election cycle typically means it's harder to pass legislation. That said, if the policy is done and they come to an agreement, both sides would benefit from taking home a win. So from that vantage point, ESEA could be positioned for that. But the dynamics in the House definitely complicate things.
And I'll just add to that, we know that things change on a dime. We've had, if you're reading the headlines, there's been a lot of upheaval. And so depending on which way the wind blows and things are going, ESEA's chances look better or worse. So we want to be sure that we have information out, because it could happen. It could happen if, for example, Congressman Klein is the interim speaker, that changes things again. So we want you to have the information and know, regardless of when, sort of what the what is behind ESEA reauthorization. And what we want to do, before we open it up for questions, I want to let you know about some resources that we have available, and then Patricia will she will man the chat box. So Philip, why don't you let us know about what the Alliance has to offer?
Sure. So we have some general ESEA information and recommendation, some information on those issues that we're very concerned about, mainly around on accountability, available on our website. Here's the URL, and then we also provide 5-minute video updates on things that are happening in federal education policy, and we send them out often weekly, sometimes once every 2 weeks. We don't want to fill your inbox with information that's not timely and relevant. But if you'd be interested in getting an email when our federal flash, our 5-minute videos become available, you can email us at alliance@allfored.org, and we will add you to the list. We just did a federal flash this morning, and that video just became available.
And I'll just say that I love the Federal Flash. I don't watch TV, but I'm sort of a Federal Flash junkie. I will admit to even having watched the Federal Flash on my iPhone on the Metro. So if you don't like soap operas, but you want to get a little 5-minute federal policy update from our friends at the Alliance, I highly recommend what they have to offer. And then from NAEHCY, in terms of more information for our specific policy recommendations, more in depth on our website there. And I should say for both of us too, we've really kind of given maybe a superficial overview of ESEA, its similarities, and even within McKinney-Vento, there's certainly many more details that you can get on our website, and also for our legislative emails. I would say only send them out when there's something really noteworthy and newsworthy or actionable. You can sign up at that link there. You do have this PowerPoint available to you, so that's something you can just go ahead and click on once you open up the PowerPoint. And I think now we are ready to turn it over to Patricia to tell us what kind of questions we have.
Thanks, Barbara. We do have quite a few questions, particularly related to the McKinney-Vento Act, but I think I'll start with something that's a bit more procedural and that maybe you and Philip might want to chime in on. And the question is, what can we as organizations do to support or not support certain provisions pertaining to the McKinney-Vento Act? Is it too late to contact senators or representatives to try to have some input into these decisions?
Well, that is a very good question because a lot of what's happening right now are sort of closed door meetings between the conferees and committee staff, but it ain't over till it's over. So I think the best thing to do is obviously face-to-face meeting. We do have on our website, materials and things you can copy and paste for the provisions that you feel strongly about. So we do have Microsoft Word document. You could send letters, but my recommendation is when members of Congress are on break, when they're back home in the district, to try to set up meetings with them or their staff, their legislative directors, to explain what it looks like locally, what policies are helping, what policies are not helping, and to begin to convey that information. Obviously, we don't have a crystal ball, so I can't say do this next week or do it next month, but the sooner the better, because the conversations are happening right now, regardless of when the political winds align in the correct direction. The substantive conversations on policy are happening now. So that would be my recommendation, is to really try to reach out and have meetings, particularly when the member and or his staff are back in the district. Philip, maybe you have some other processy advocacy tips.
I totally agree. I think that because regardless of when the politics works out to have a final vote, as Barbara is saying, the details are being worked out right now. So there's the early bird catches the worm in most situations, and in policies, certainly that's the case as well. So I think that that reaching out and even if your member is not one of those people, one of those few people that is specifically negotiating the legislation, it's always, those people can always make a phone call, or if they're so motivated, even send a letter, but just checking in on a specific provision. Because remember, they're negotiating hundreds of pages of legislation, so it's important to make sure that those provisions that are important to you, that that they don't get overlooked as part of just the legislators and the staff. They're just human beings, and so it's not even due to malintent if something gets overlooked or unaddressed. It's just volume, especially volume within a tight time frame, because we're really trying to finish the negotiations over the next couple of weeks. So I think it would definitely be worthwhile to reach out to your members and staff.
Thanks, Philip and Barbara. I have one more kind of procedural question for you, and it's about Arne Duncan's decision to step down. What, if any, effect do you think that has on ESEA moving forward? And do we have any idea when his replacement will come on board?
That's for you, Philip.
Sure. So I don't think that the Secretary stepping down is really going to impact the policy. I think that that him stepping down, if anything, is just a statement of how hard he thinks it's going to be to get something finalized. When he steps down officially in December, John King, who's currently at the department, he's the former Commissioner of Education in New York. He's going to take Secretary Duncan's place. The two men are very closely aligned in their policy priorities, And so I would not see I would not foresee any sort of major shift in policy coming from the administration. I think that the president's selection of John King to serve as acting secretary is really just a cementing of the administration's policy. One item that may be a procedural or of interest if you're a procedural person, um, they do not plan to have John King go through a laborious confirmation process this late into the president's term. So he will technically be serving as acting secretary, but at this point it's really a difference without a distinction. He will be the nation's top education officer in the federal government.
Thanks, Philip. That's really helpful. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and get to a couple of substantive questions about the proposals to reauthorize the McKinney-Vento Act. And Barbara, you spoke a little bit about a new requirement regarding the state coordinator having sort of appropriate time to do their duties. And the question came up, who will be making the determination whether or not that requirement is being met?
Every state is monitored by the federal government, by the U.S. Department of Education. Federal monitoring changes, as those of you who've been around, sometimes it's paper monitoring, sometimes it's more in-depth and includes visits and interviews, but the federal government that'll be one of they have to monitor to see whether the states are carrying out the McKinney-Vento Act. You can look with the CSPR or monitoring reports and see where McKinney-Vento has been monitored and where states have had findings. So anything that's a requirement of the state will certainly be something that will be monitored by the U.S. Department of Education. So that's where the accountability would lie there, is monitoring from the U.S. Department of Education. So for example, sufficiently able, if it's, the law says the state coordinator must be able to sufficiently carry out the responsibilities. If there's evidence that that's not the case, that would be a finding, and there would have to be some corrective action taken.
Thanks, Barbara. I certainly agree that that'd be the method for accountability that would be most common. I guess as the lawyer on the call, I might just add that there haven't been many lawsuits on McKinney-Vento, but there have been some, and every time we get some additional language in the law, that's sort of another legal hook that an attorney could potentially hang a lawsuit on. So there may or may not end up being some accountability there as well if this becomes the law, which we will, I guess, see over the next weeks and months. Another question for you, Barbara, related to the substance. You talked about the increased, I guess I would say, clarification around ensuring that students can have access to extracurricular activities. And there's a question about funding for transportation to and from those activities. So I wonder if you could talk for a minute about what funding might be available to provide transportation to extracurricular activities for students who are homeless.
Well, the McKinney-Vento funding is, the provisions around how McKinney-Vento funding can be used for transportation are not altered by this legislation. So funding that is not otherwise provided, supplemental funding, so McKinney-Vento funding, obviously extremely limited and extremely underfunded, remains a source of funding, as does Title I. Again, Title I funding is to make sure that homeless children have access to educational opportunities offered by the school district. So to the extent that it's an educational opportunity, which I guess some extracurricular activities could be construed as, some would not be, there would be that. We really are looking at the overall funding for McKinney-Vento. That was the last slide, where there's a very desperate need to get that authorized funding level up as part of the final bill, because that then becomes available to more school districts. And Patricia, you may have something else to add to that as well.
No, thank you. I do not. I think that was a great and complete answer. Hopefully that's helpful to the questioner. And now I have a couple of questions again for you, Barbara. These are related to the provisions that you discussed around foster care. And I'll just keep with the funding theme. Would there be any additional funding to help implement the collaborative work that's supposed to happen between the SEA and LEAs and the child welfare system? Would there be any additional funding either through the foster care system or through education?
All of the foster care pieces are within Title I. So there are assurances of Title I funding, and so that's where they live, if you will. This legislation does not amend child welfare law, so it doesn't make any changes to child welfare law. So, for example, we couldn't require that child welfare pay for transportation. We couldn't require that child welfare designate an education coordinator, because this is an education bill that only affects education agencies and education agency funding. So again, there is not a dedicated stream of funding for foster care. It's part of the Title I provisions. So, you know, the bigger the pie, the bigger Title I, there's that. But also it's important to recognize that child welfare agencies have their own pots of money, their own funding, and a lot of collaborative work has happened in states since the passage of Fostering Connections. So some of that has been funded through child welfare, some through education, and a lot of it actually through non-governmental sources as well.
Great, thank you very much. And one more also kind of related question. You spoke about if those changes to Title I are passed so that all foster youth are able to receive school stability. You mentioned that the LEAs would be required to provide transportation only under some very limited circumstances, and one of those was if the LEA actually receives reimbursement from the child welfare agency. There's a question about how would that happen? How would LEAs receive reimbursement from the child welfare agency?
Well, it actually is happening now in some jurisdictions. So it's worked out locally, but there are definitely jurisdictions across the country that have figured out collaboratively. For example, school districts may have the infrastructure, they may have the buses, so they've got something in place, but they don't have the funding. So I think that's all written. You know, what it says is a local plan to determine how transportation to the school of origin, supplemental transportation, because obviously if you're just taking a bus and having it go one stop over, that's not, you know, something that needs a whole funding stream. But the plan would need to spell out how transportation is provided, funded, and arranged. So those would be local decisions, and there, you know, the Legal Center on Foster Care and Education does have materials on their website about how transportation to the school of origin is being provided, both either through child welfare, through school districts, or through the combination. So determined locally, but we do have models that exist for how that happens.
Thanks, Barbara. I will try to find the link to that website to put in the chat box. In the meantime, we've got another sort of procedural question that maybe Philip can help us with. And the question is, how is the ESA connected to other bills? There are bills moving through Congress about homeless children and youth, such as the Homeless Children and Youth Act, the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act. There may be, you know, legislation that affects homeless youth in other parts of Congress. So how is ESEA connected to those other bills, if at all?
Well, Barbara, would you like to take that one? Or I'm happy to provide my thoughts, but I'm also happy to defer to you.
How about I go and then how about we do it together?
That's great.
So you go first and I'll follow. How about that?
Okay. So I think it depends on the specific legislation. So for like the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, and that's pretty distinct from ESEA. So there, I don't see much of a much of a connection between between the two, and you know, they're really there. I don't know that there's the level of coordination between social services and education that perhaps that there could be, and the degree to which ESEA facilitates that. I mean, I really think that it's that there's perhaps an over reliance, but it's a reliance on this program, and maybe they foresee more of that happening with the additional foster care provisions. taking place. Um, on the the definitions bill, the connection really is that that piece of legislation would help to coordinate between HUD and the Department of Education. So it will move separately from ESEA, but the policies are very much connected.
And I'll just say too that the Congress gets hung up on what's germane. So in order for something to be attached to ESEA, like for example, Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, it would have to be seen as germane. And since neither Runaway and Homeless Youth nor the Homeless Children Youth Act are education bills specifically, they certainly impact education and they have a lot to do with education. But because they are not specifically education bills, it's unlikely that we would see either of those two bills attached to ESEA or vice versa moving forward. So they all, it's much more likely that we would say Runaway and Homeless Youth Act because it has a trafficking provision attached to another vehicle, or Homeless Children Youth Act attached to another vehicle, or any of the above attached to a budget vehicle, but not very likely that we'd see them attached to education just because they probably would not be considered germane.
Thanks, Philip and Barbara. Those were certainly far more nuanced answers than I could have given to that question. So thank you very much for that. And we do have one more substantive question about the potential McKinney-Vento Act changes. As you know, under current McKinney-Vento law, there's what I would call a potential inconsistency between what the statute says and what the Department of Education has said about providing transportation to the school of origin once a student finds permanent housing. So although it's very clear that the child can remain in the school of origin until the end of the school year when the child finds permanent housing, the Department of Education has stated that transportation is no longer required once the student finds permanent housing. Is that something that may potentially be addressed in these amendments?
As a matter of fact, it is. Neither the House nor the Senate agree with the Department of Education's interpretation, and so both bills make clear that transportation is to be provided until the end of the school year once a child obtains permanent housing if it's in their best interest to stay. So both bills do make that clarification that make clear that, if it's in your best interest to stay till the end of the academic year, once you've received permanent housing, transportation is required. So they're very consistent in that on that question.
Great, thanks, Barbara. So at this point, I think we have addressed all of the questions that came up in the chat box. We probably still have a minute or two left if somebody wants to quickly type in a last-minute question, but that's all that I have. So I will turn it back over to Philip and Barbara.
Just to say thank you for your time this afternoon. This last slide has our contact information on it. If you have other questions that come to you, you can email any of us. So thank you for being here. And I again want to thank our very special guest, my good friend and great colleague, Philip Lovell with the Alliance for Excellent Education. So happy he could join us and that we could introduce you to the great work that they do.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. You guys are doing just amazing work for kids who really need it, and the more opportunities I have to work with you all, the more all the more important I see the work as, and all the more respect I have for the work that you do. So thanks very much.
Have a great weekend, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.